Alright, so to move forward, I want to talk about meiosis some more, but before doing so, I want to mention that this is from our classroom, this picture, and it shows different things, and it's over there on the wall, it's behind the cabinet on the wall, I can't really see it, we're sitting in the back. I keyed it out for you, you should be able to identify different phases of meiosis on that. So that might be worth taking a look at some point during the lab time. The main order of business today is to talk about the ovarian cycle twice, shown here. The first time I'm going to talk about it would be in reference to meiosis. What I'm going to do is go through all the phases of the ovarian cycle. It's a 28-day cycle. And we're going to match up what's going on inside the ovary in a 28-day cycle. So to talk about the female repro physiology, we're going to talk about the ovarian cycle. 28-day cycle. However, to back it up a bit, before birth, I had said this before in the endocrine lecture, perhaps you forgot that. You're going to have the cells that are the eggs are called the oogonium before birth. Oogonia undergo mitosis, regular cell division. Not meiosis, mitosis. And what I had said was that when you get to about the 7th month of pregnancy, that you get follicular development. The follicles form. You're going to get primordials. Okay. And you can see them there. It's an oocyte. We call it a primary oocyte. And it's surrounded by a layer of squamous cells, which I'll draw in red. Now there's a nucleus in there undergoing meiosis. You've already entered meiosis. However, what we'll see is that I'm writing 2NR. You have 23 tetrads. You're stuck in prophase 1. So in terms of meiosis, that's what's happening in the primordials. And in terms of numbers, by the time you get to birth, maybe you have 1 million primordial follicles. And they're all stuck in prophase 1. And so the follicles, again, they contain the primary oocyte, the egg. We don't call it oogonia anymore. We call it oocyte because it's the egg that's undergoing meiosis. Okay, it's stuck in prophase 1. So this is prophase 1 of meiosis 1. I shouldn't have to remind you of that, but I'll throw it up here anyway so you're not confusing meiosis with mitosis. So the primary oocyte is stuck in prophase 1. Let's skip from birth to puberty, 12.5 years. Because in puberty, you're down to something like 400,000 primordials. Primordial follicles. Again, still stuck in prophase 1. Again, we still call it a primary oocyte. And why is the term primary used? How many rounds of meiosis are there? 2. So you call it primary when we're in meiosis 1. We will call it secondary when we get to meiosis 2. Okay, so you have to differentiate the oocyte from the follicle that it's contained within. And keep track of those two. So now you've reached puberty, about age 12 or 13, and what you do is every month we select a cohort of 20 to undergo further development. So how about to keep track of things on this side of the board? Let's go meiosis, whatever's going on with the oocyte, meiosis, and on this side let's put, well, what we're doing now is we're going into the ovarian cycle, the follicular phase. In the ovarian cycle. A regular 28-day cycle. So what you do is every cycle from puberty to menopause, you select a group of about 20 to undergo further follicle development, right? Follicle phase. Select a group or cohort, about 20-ish follicles to undergo further development. Okay, and how does it do that? Well, let's remember our gonadotropins, FSH, it has a lot to do with it. And so if you look at that, those are primordials, but when you advance beyond the primordial stage, the first one is primary. There's primary. Let's go in order. Primordial, primary, and for both of these are both immature. So for meiosis, what you could put is, for both of these are both in primary oocyte. We stuck in 2NR, 23 tetrads, prophase 1. That's why I give the meiosis lecture first, so the prophase 1 and tetrads, all that stuff. Yeah, you've seen it before. After that, where we're going with this is we want to get to ovulation, right? But for now, at least we want to talk about a structure that can secrete sex hormones, because the primary, primordial or primary follicles, they don't secrete any hormones. They're immature follicles. So when you progress to a secondary follicle, again, we've selected a group of 20. We're getting past the primordial to primary. You go from primary to secondary. Now you get some structures that are indications of a mature follicle. And I have 2 on the slide, theca and zona pellucida. But let's add to that the granulosa cells. Theca, granulosa cells, many of them. These are cells, thecal cells, granulosa cells are the cells of the secondary of the follicle, not the oocyte. Okay? And add to that zona pellucida. Now the zona pellucida is like an eggshell. It's a glycoprotein eggshell. It contains proteins, ZP1, ZP4. It's not part of the cell. It's a shell around the cell. Those proteins contain sperm receptors. It'll become important later when we talk about fertilization. So note those three things. Theca, granule cell, ZP, zona pellucida. Okay? Those are things we start to see in the more mature follicles. These follicles are secreting estrogen. So again, we're getting 20 of them. And this is the endocrine function. They secrete things like estrogen. Okay. I talked about that before. In terms of meiosis, we still call it, even though it's a secondary follicle, the cell inside of it is still considered a primary oocyte. It's still 2nR is 23 tetrads. You are not progressing past prophase 1. So I'm writing it all again to solidify that fact in your head. We're just stuck there. Okay? And we've reached secondary follicle phase. We still call it a primary oocyte. When you get to late secondary, they show a late secondary follicle. Of these 20 that reached secondary, one will achieve dominance and progress further. Okay. We're still in the follicle phase. So let me clear the board here. So in terms of reproduction, we have follicle cells secreting estrogen. That's good. We have follicle cell one. We want one to ovulate. Okay. So of the 20, choose one. So in terms of follicular development, call it late secondary. Maybe this is the one that achieved dominance. One follicle achieves dominance, progresses further. It makes it to late secondary and then Graphian. But what we'll see is this one follicle, it probably has the most FSH receptors. Okay, remember, if you present the most FSH receptors, you'll develop faster and further. Okay, that's why one makes it past to here. And in terms of meiosis, this is the one follicle that will finish meiosis 1 when you're in late secondary going into Graphian. Complete meiosis 1. Now that division, where one cell becomes 2, it's not an equal division. It's an unequal division of cytoplasm. So I'm trying to draw like a cytokinesis. You go through prophase 1, metaphase 1, anaphase 1, and when you start to pinch off in telophase 1, for example, let me draw the maybe it divides in a way where I'll try to like do what I did last time. Like you had long purple, short purple, or long green, short green. Maybe this cell gets the long green, short green. Maybe it divides like that. Okay, and this becomes 2 cells. So let's pretend it pinches off. You complete meiosis 1. So you just completely pinch off. So one green, that's long and then short. In one small cell, they got nothing, hardly any cytoplasm. You put all the cytoplasm in the big cell. This cell is the oocyte that will undergo ovulation. It will be ovulated. Just draw much bigger. I happen to divide it in a way so I've got all the purple chromosomes. One long, one short. Okay, I illustrated that way. Most books illustrate it that way, long, short chromosomes. And in our lab, we have long chromosomes, short chromosomes. When we use bottle brush things to symbolize. Okay, so the long, short thing. Okay, so what do we call this cell now? This cell will enter meiosis II. Okay, but for now, because it enters meiosis II, let's no longer call it primary oocyte. Let's now call it secondary oocyte, entering meiosis II. Secondary oocyte enters meiosis II. And we call this, with the green chromosomes, the first polar body. So those are the two cells of meiosis I. In terms of the ploidy, each one is NR. It's haploid, but it's replicated, right? Because you got the dyad there. Each cell, this one and that one, has 23 dyads. And so does this one, 23 dyads. So let's proceed. We go from secondary to Graafian. This Graafian, basically what it says there is, you're not going to finish meiosis II. You're going to be stuck somewhere in meiosis II. Because you don't want to finish in the sperm arrive. Alright, so let's kind of clear this out. Still in the follicle phase. But now we got our one follicle that makes it all the way to Graafian, that will ovulate. There can only be one Graafian follicle. On the slide they call it the vesicular follicle, they're called that too. Well, anyways, that's the stage of follicular development. In terms of meiosis II, it becomes arrested in metaphase II. It will not complete unless sperm is present. So if you kind of draw, yeah, so let's kind of draw the little polar body. With the green chromosomes, the dyads line up in the middle. One long, one short. So you're kind of like that. They're attached in the middle of the X. That's metaphase 2 for one cell. Let's draw the other cell, the one that got all the cytoplasm. There's no nuclear envelope, not going to draw that. And I'm kind of simplifying the centrosome. And they got the purple, one long, one short. You attach at the central mirror right in the middle there, right? And then you're just arrested in metaphase 2, maybe anaphase 2, depending on what book you're reading. So that's kind of where we are. Metaphase 2 or anaphase 2 arrest. Doesn't matter which one. The point is you don't finish unless sperm get there. Okay, so this is what you ovulate. So you go to Graafian. Of the 28-day cycle, this is about halfway through. Ovulation occurs at around day 14. shown here. This is what you ovulate. Okay? Ovulate the secondary oocyte. That's what this is. Secondary oocyte stuck in metaphase 2 arrest. You ovulate it to the ampulla of uterine tube, which is the typical site of fertilization. Okay? So this is what you ovulate. I don't even know what happens to the first polar body, first PB. It doesn't matter. You don't fertilize that. You fertilize the thing that has all the cytoplasm. Okay, let's see here. Let's let's go to past ovulation, to the luteal phase. Here's a ruptured follicle ovulating. It's a real picture, not an illustration. That's a real secondary oocyte, one cell. That's the ruptured follicle. They happened to open it up. I don't know what procedure they were doing, but they got a clear view of the ovary and a clear view inside the ovary of a follicle that's ovulating. Okay. Again, they call it egg. It's really called secondary oocyte. We're in meiosis 2. We're stuck in anaphase, metaphase 2. When you get to the luteal phase, so what happens is you've had a Graafian follicle. It ruptures because it ovulates. Ruptured. So it's a bleeding body now because it ruptured. Most things that rupture do bleed. It's literally called a bleeding body. It's transformed into a yellow body called the corpus luteum. The hormone LH, it causes the transformation of a bleeding body into a yellow body. And we call that yellow body corpus luteum. So now we're in a different phase of the ovarian cycle. We've had our follicular phase, maybe the first couple of weeks where we went through all the phases of all the way up to Graafian. Then we ovulated. You should note to yourself, ovulation, it marks the end of the follicle phase of this 28-day cycle. I'll squeeze that in there as a side note. Marks the end of follicle phase. I mean, I shouldn't have to say that. I mean, it's something different, but I'll just throw it in there just to make sure it's clear. So now we're in the luteal phase, okay, of the ovarian cycle. So I'm going to clear the board here. Let me just start again. Now the luteal phase, second couple of weeks, and well, let's go back to here. We have to talk about option A, option B. Are you pregnant or not? Because we've ovulated, and if you're going to ovulate, that's day 14, right? If you've forgotten that, write it again. On average, day 14. Let's say you're pregnant. Call that option A. Sperm's present. So you got your secondary oocyte. I'll draw the sperm getting in there. Okay, maybe it contributes 2 blue chromosomes. One long, one short. Now you were stuck in metaphase metaphase 2. Let's keep track. Let's keep an inventory here. So you had I want to start to pull them apart. You had a long and a short, a long and a short, and you're pulling them apart. Let's say in anaphase 2. Okay, and let's not forget about the thing you ejected from before. You had the first PB, and it was stuck in the same thing. Let's say this is the first polar body. You had a long green and a short green, long green, short green, and you're pulling it apart. So this cell is the first PB, our first polar body. So this is meiosis 2. 2 cells becoming 4. Okay? This is one cell, this is one cell. They're going to become 4. Let's do the first polar body first. Let's say it divides, but who cares? It's just a polar body, right? But this, for the sake of talking about 4 cells, not really a cell, got no cytoplasm. So what do I draw in it? I draw one green long, one green short in each of them. It's truly haploid now. So long, short, that's what it got. So these 2 polar bodies came from the first one. Consider that like 2 of the cells. So what happens with, this is what's important. This is fertilization. You're pulling the purples apart that are maternal. Half of them go to paternal chromosome. The other 2 are ejected into a second polar body. So this one, let's just draw it again. Okay. So we're getting the long purple, short purple. Long, short. It's going to intermix with. There's a lot of steps here. I don't want to get into all the steps. I'll teach them later. But the point is, half got ejected into a second polar body. The other half went to the male chromosomes to intermix for conception. Okay. So you no longer call it secondary oocyte. Once you fertilize, it's like you call it the 1 cell stage. It all started off as 1 cell. So let's call this, let's pinch it off and boom. Second PB. All right, so I got 3 polar bodies here. This is the cell that's important. This is like the fertilized egg, 1 cell stage. I'll say fertilized oocyte, 1 cell stage of what? Of development of a baby. A baby that's 1 cell, right? And it's going to develop. We'll get into that. That's the next chapter. But anyways, okay, the whole reason about showing the corpus luteum is this is all happening on day 14. But the second couple of weeks, luteal phase, day 15 to 27, what's going on? You have the corpus luteum secreting progesterone. That is the hormone that is getting the endometrium ready for pregnancy, okay, for this that will implant about a week after this fertilization event. Okay. So the corpus luteum secreting progesterone, great. If you're pregnant, it'll persist. However, let's go through option B. Okay, let's pretend this is option A, pregnant. Option A is pregnant. Corpus luteum. It lives. It doesn't die. It'll keep going on. It persists. It'll keep secreting progesterone. You miss menses. Keeps secreting progesterone. As a result, you miss your menstrual period. And everyone knows, hey, that's, well, you might be pregnant. So that's option A. I'll give you that. That's the luteal phase. Well, let's say you kind of miss menses or you're pregnant. What's option B is when you're not pregnant. Okay? So let's go through that option. This is option A, pregnant. So let's, here. Option A, pregnant. Option B, not pregnant. In meiosis, the secondary oocyte, no sperm present. It never finishes meiosis 2. Without pregnancy, the corpus luteum has about a 2-week lifespan, after which it dies and then becomes a white scar, shown there on the slide. And we call it, of course we call it something, white scar or corpus albicans. Albino means white, albicans. Okay, so a whitish appearance, you're not pregnant. But menses will occur because now this living endocrine structure, the corpus luteum, basically died, became a white scar, no progesterone. Nothing to maintain the endometrium. I'm writing menses occurs. So, just to walk it back, what I taught was this figure, okay? Starting with, it's a good thing to go over your notes today, what you want to do. Go over your notes, rewrite them until you understand them, and then look at this figure. And then with your notes that you've rewritten, look here. I started from here. I said before birth. I said oogonium. Okay, I said oogonia, plural, that's singular. But anyways, I said, yeah, you get development of the primordial follicles. I said 2NR. They just say 2N. I always throw the R in there. I want you to remember it's diploid replicated. Okay? Then they go from infancy and childhood, primordials, right? Arrested in prophase 1. Then every month from puberty to menopause, puberty is about 12 and a half years, all the way to menopause, which is about age 50.5 in women, you get this development. They show one follicle, but how many did I say you select? To about 20. To reach secondary, the vesicular, and what I said was the one secondary that achieves dominance to make it to Graphian, that's the one that will complete meiosis 1. That's why they have this little spindle here. This one cell becomes 2. So what they do is they put a little N in there, but I don't like that. I put NR. The R means replicated. each of these two cells has not 23 tetrads, 23 dyads. It's haploid, but it's replicated in both of these cells. This cell is now called secondary oocyte because we're done with meiosis 1. Okay. Meiosis 2, called a secondary oocyte. What I had said was, it won't finish unless sperm is present. Okay, of course you have to ovulate as a precursor. All right. And then if sperm is present, at the bottom here, this first polar body has a division. And here's the second polar body that has 23 single chromosomes. All of these ends are true ends, 23 single chromosomes. But what's the one set that counts of the 4? This set. This set becomes the baby with the male chromosomes. Okay. These other 3, I always get asked about this. They're irrelevant. They're not important. They don't matter. They didn't reproduce. So whatever genes are in them go away. All right. Now what I want to do is kind of like hit the reset button and do the ovarian cycle again. But what now I want to mention is the uterine cycle with it. Okay. I do have some questions here. I want to maybe ask you these some other time after you've had time to process the information. So what I want to do now to kind of like show ovarian cycle with another cycle. Here's ovarian cycle. On the bottom is the uterine cycle. But we also have to pay attention to the hormones and the feedbacks. The gonadotropins, estrogen, progesterone, and also gonadotropin releasing hormone. So a good way to categorize this information, I always present it as 3 columns on the board. All right, on this side, let's put the hypothalamus with the ant pit, anterior pituitary. There are some gonadotropins that are important. And in the middle of the board, put the ovary. It's going to secrete sex hormones that feed back on the hypothalamus ant pit, but also to help further develop the uterus. In particular, endometrium. Functional layer only. Right, that basal layer is non-responsive. They even show that on the figure there. So what they show is, well, let me just ask you. Look at this darker pink on the bottom. What is that, functional or basal? Basal, but the one that's changing, that's functional. It's all endometrium. And what we got here is, let's start. We got a 28-day cycle. Let's start at the end of the previous cycle. You weren't pregnant. Okay? So at the end of the previous cycle, you weren't pregnant. What happens is the sex hormone layers crash. Call it day 28. You have low estrogen. I abbreviate that EST sometimes. And you also have low progesterone, or PROG for short. Anyways, those hormones, those sex hormones, they were maintaining the thickened endometrium from the previous cycle, but you weren't pregnant, so those hormone levels crashed. It causes the spiral arteries to spasm. It disrupts the blood flow, and that tissue of the endometrium, it sloughs off in menses. Menses is days 28 to day 5 of the next new cycle. So where we are in the figure, see the light blue? That's menses. So we get this last strip. Menses. Because look at estrogen and testosterone, estrogen and progesterone. They dropped. Okay? So that's why those low levels cause it. So when we go to these first 5 days here, days 28 all the way up to day 5, One thing to pay attention to is when you have low estrogen progesterone, that removes the inhibition on GnRH. Gonadotropin releasing hormone is from the hypothalamus. You'll see the pulses start to increase days 1 to 5. Okay. So it starts to increase ever so slightly, right there. So that's important, because once you get that, you're going to start to get the release of FSH. So the GnRH, you start to see some levels rise of the gonadotropin, follicle stimulating hormone. So what that will do is that'll stimulate the development. Again, you'll select your group of 20 follicles to develop. Just like we talked before, they proceed past primordial to primary to secondary. And again, you need to remember all the details, and where you started your notes with these 3 columns, if you're taking notes, this is what I'm going to ask you to write about on your essay for the next test. So if you want to make a note to yourself, wherever you started this, when I started teaching from this figure, that's it. Okay. And then so I mention that because I present details I expect you to remember. For example, for the secondary follicle, do you remember all the mature structures we saw, like theca, granulosa cells? What we had said in a previous lecture, the theca cells secrete androstenedione. So the theca cells, you get, I'll write it again, androstenedione. So what we also said was FSH, I'll draw a red arrow, like a stimulatory effect. FSH, it helps stimulate the androstenedione. When the androstenedione is transferred to the granulosa cells, there's an enzyme called aromatase. That will convert the androstenedione to estrone. And so I drew the red arrow of FSH. Not only does it help develop the follicles, it helps increase the aromatase activity to get your hormone, estrone. So I'll put that with the red arrow. Increase aromatase activity. That's a very important enzyme because it gets you your estrogen. Estrone is one of the estrogens. Okay, so that's an important first step. So on the figure, we're moving out of menses and rebuilding the endometrium. So we're getting into from light blue to dark blue. See this first increase here? So in terms of days, menses day 28 to 5. So it's like we're kind of day 6 to 13, but we're in the first half of that, day 6 to 13. Maybe call that 6 to 10-ish, something like that. Okay, we get this rise in estrogen. So what happens is, estrone, I'll draw a red arrow from here to there, it's going to cause the proliferative phase. You're going to thicken that endometrium in ways that we've discussed For example, increased uterine glands that secrete glycogen. Increase the spiral arteries for the blood. More blood for the implanting blastocysts if one should arrive. Increase spiral arteries. You're going to get ready for progesterone. Okay, so this proliferative phase, again, just to remind you of the days, I mean, it's right there on the table. Day 6 to 13. We're going to get ready for the second half of this 28-day cycle. So you want to prime for progesterone by now expressing more progesterone receptors. So increase progesterone receptors. Also, we're getting ready for ovulation. If you ovulate and fertilize, you want to let sperm in. So during the proliferative phase in the uterus, you dissolve the mucus plug at cervix to let sperm in. Always write details down with how is this helping repro? Let sperm in, that's obvious. So in terms of where we are, we're progressing right up to here. We're at the secondary follicle phase. We're starting to get enough estrogen to rebuild the endometrium. And what did we say before? Of the 20, how many achieve dominance? 1. So let's get to that point again. So we get 1 secondary, that becomes graphene. Now before I erase the board, there is one important negative feedback I want you to know. So I'm going to use blue for negative feedback. So estrone negatively feeds back on FSH. So there's a few feedbacks here. This one's a negative feedback. Negative feedback. Negative feedback, if you'll recall, turn off the original stimulus. So we're turning off FSH. The estrogen, the rise in estrogen here, turns off the FSH. Just like we're telling the body, okay, we've selected our 20, they've developed, we don't need FSH anymore. This feedback is shown on the figure. Look at the FSH line. There's a drop right there, right after they show the the secondary. So it's causing that. It's this first rise in estrogen that's causing that drop off in FSH because of the negative feedback. So that's an important connection to make. Otherwise, we just keep ovulating and ovulating and ovulating. We just want one to ovulate. All right, so I'm going to clear the board. Before I do that, are there any questions on these notes? I didn't see any hands. Sorry, go ahead.
So if it's the negative feedback, that means they're pregnant already, or it
No.
just stops it just because you can't ovulate?
Yeah, it just stops. You develop 20. You don't want to develop 200 and have 10 ovulations because the uterus can only support 1 implantation. So I think that's kind of why you turn it off at this point. Doesn't mean you're pregnant yet. Yeah.
But after the 20's made, you're saying?
Yeah, after the 20's made, turn it off.
Done.
Yeah. Anything else? So the most important day of the 28-day cycle is day 14 because that's when you ovulate. We haven't gotten there yet. Right now we're at secondary. We're going to get to 1 achieve dominance, you get to graphene. Look at that. 1 reaches the graphene development. I'll just put 1 reaches graphene. Well, anyways, the graphene follicle is bigger. You'll actually see an even sharper increase in estrogen at this point. Okay, we're still in the proliferative phase. They're kind of right here, kind of like 10 to 13, about graphene. That's kind of where they put it. If the days help you, day 10 to 13. Okay, so you get more increases in estrogen. This will continue the proliferative phase. So what we're saying is the estrogen is causing the proliferative phase. I put the word cause. It's very important you make those connections. When a student writes about the hormones in this hormone causes that. This hormone negative feeds back on that, turns that off. That's really the mark of, I was telling my morning class, that's the mark of the A student. You remember the steps, and you tell me what the hormones do. I would say like the B student, they remember the steps, then they don't make the connections. They don't know this causes that. Maybe the B student will have this. I'll erase that, and this is what you'll turn in, and I mark a point off. And you're like, why? So what causes that? And you don't know. That's why you lost the point. So it's very important you show me you understand. Okay, that's physiology. That's the process here. The hormones are driving everything. The other thing here is this larger increase in estrogen, well, before, a little increase in estrogen was a negative feedback. This larger increase in estrogen is a positive feedback. I'm going to use red for positive feedback. What happens is, this causes a surge in LH. LH surge. The LH surge is this huge release of gonadotropin. Not the FSH now, the LH, the other gonadotropin. Right here. This huge upstroke is the LH surge. It's surging, and it correlates with this larger rise in estrogen due to the large graphene follicle. And you saw how big they were under the microscope. You can see them under a low magnification. So the LH surge happens, and that kicks off a whole lot of events. LH triggers ovulation. I'll draw an arrow going back to here. As you remember, ovulation is the day. You have our ovulation, and if you remember our meiosis notes, you're ovulating the secondary oocyte. It ovulates into the uterine tube, okay? But it's LH that triggered it. And what we had said was, it's the graphene follicle make the connection that ruptures. Okay, it ruptures, and when it ruptures, that's ovulation. So think of that as one follicle that made it all the way to graphene. It ruptured in ovulation and became a bleeding body. The egg is gone, and what's left behind is a ruptured follicle that bleeds, called the bleeding body. This is the remnant of what's left of the graphene follicle. So it's all one thing I'm describing here. The bleeding body will transform into the yellow body, again, via LH. I had mentioned this before. Bleeding body, transform, yellow body. We call that corpus luteum. Okay. However, that comes next. The ovulation event, right in the middle, day 14, okay, where LH triggered it. However, I should also mention, I'm going to draw another arrow. Not only does LH trigger ovulation, it transforms the bleeding body into yellow body. So be sure you understand that LH causes this transformation. Okay? And the corpus luteum, that takes us past day 14 into what we call now the luteal phase. So if you're following along here, the dark blue was the proliferative phase. Then we have ovulation right in the middle. When we get to the light green, well, that's the luteal phase. So there's the corpus luteum on the figure. Its job is to secrete progesterone. Now the progesterone, it will target the endometrium and take you into the secretory phase. Causes secretory phase in the endometrium. Now the secretory phase, all the details I mentioned before, pretty much what's different is, well, look at it, it's thicker. Okay? Everything's proliferated. You got a lot of uterine glands, spiral arteries. I would say what's different is there's so much proliferation from before, the endometrium becomes a secretory mucosa, hence the name. Endometrium becomes secretory mucosa. If fertilization occurred, it would have occurred already. On which day? Day 14. That's the day you ovulated. Maybe sperm was there, maybe it wasn't. This is after. Now we're in the luteal phase, so now we're talking day 15 to 25. Okay. Oh, day 15 to 27 to make it inclusive. Now, so we have to do some thinking here of the days. If you fertilized, it happened on around day 14. Implantation would not occur in the uterus until about a week to 10 days later. So let's say it's 10 days later. What's 10 days after 14? 24. So it would occur right in the peak of the secretory phase, okay, if you have it. So basically, another change is you want to reform mucus plug at cervix to keep additional sperm from entering. Reform mucus plug at cervix. You want a private uterus, right? If implantation is going to occur, it's a private party there. So we're kind of right here. The other thing is, the progesterone causes the secretory phase. It also has a powerful negative feedback. Powerful negative feedback. Again, you turn off the original stimulus. What was the stimulus? LH. You turn that off. That's why the LH surge appears as a spike. The positive feedback caused the spike, the upstroke, but the negative feedback makes it drop really quick. Okay? That's why it's a spike. So those two things, powerful negative feedback and secretory phase. Okay, but that's your luteal phase right there. And we're right in the second half there. Okay. So I'm going to erase the board again. Do you have any questions? At this point, we need to go through, again, the two options. Are you pregnant or not pregnant? where we're at, we're trying to figure out if you're pregnant or not. Let's do the not pregnant option first. You're not pregnant, or what happened? Well, where did we leave off? We had that powerful negative feedback from this huge rise in progesterone. Okay, that turned off the thing that gave it life, LH. No LH. Okay. Here we had a corpus luteum. And here we're all ready for pregnancy. Okay, we had the secretory phase. Let's say you get to like day 26, 27-ish. Look, the hormone levels are dropping off. Why? Here's why. With no LH to sustain corpus luteum, the corpus luteum has about a 2-week lifespan. Without LH, has a 2-week lifespan. And so as I said before, there's no LH, it can't live, it'll die. It dies, it becomes corpus albicans. Corpus albicans, but this is why you get this huge drop-off of progesterone as well as estrogen. As you can look at the figure, when you get towards the end of the cycle, they start to drop off, okay? And now we're back to where we started, day 28. Menses occurs. It's due to low estrogen progesterone. That's where we started, so we went full circle. And so the only thing we need to do now is talk about option B, this time pregnant. Okay, that's the whole point of this lecture of reproduction. Okay, so we still have the thing where there's not going to be any LH. That's still true. I'm going to leave that up there, but we can kind of reboot from this part. Go back in the time machine there. And let's say you were pregnant. If fertilization occurred, what's the day? 14. Day 14 was fertilization. But I said you implant maybe 10 days later. So maybe day 24 you had implantation. So what we'll learn later is that if you have implantation with a pregnancy, implantation of a structure called blastocyst into endometrium. There's a hormone that's secreted called HCG. It stands for human chorionic gonadotropin. This is what they test for in home pregnancy tests. It's a hormone, so where does it travel in? Bloodstream, it spills into the urine, you can test it on dipstick. If it's there, it came from the baby, you are pregnant, okay? There's barely any false positives that can occur there. So, okay, so you get that. Here's corpus luteum. What does this hormone do? It's a chorionic gonadotropin. It'll help sustain corpus luteum. So I'll draw right arrow, sustain. Because let's remember, why do you need it? There's no LH. This was the first gonadotropin that helped create it, and now it's gone. But you want to keep it alive, because with HCG, you've had this implantation, you want to maintain the endometrium. You don't want to have menses. You'll lose the implantation, right? So, by sustaining corpus luteum, it just stays alive. It will continue to secrete, pump out progesterone. Continue to pump out progesterone. And that will in turn sustain the pregnancy, right? Will sustain endometrium, thus sustaining the pregnancy. You find out by, you miss menses. So that's a big moment to find that out, whether you're planning it or not. You find out, and you want to go to the doctor, and what do they ask you usually? Anyone know?
First day of the last period.
When was the first day of your last period? Because that's usually something a woman can remember. But when you had your period the last time, were you pregnant? Class? No. So why does he ask you that? Well, because it's the physical thing that you can recall. So what he assumes is 2 weeks later, your next ovulation, that's the one. Okay. So normal gestation is 38 weeks, so you just add 2 weeks and bump it up to 40, right? Okay. Well, I got to that, so it means I'm done.